All right. Tonight, we're going to start a series where we're going to discuss some of the intricacies of our book on Three River Stadium, celebrating 50 years since the birth of what I think is an iconic facility where most of my childhood memories of sports started, and certainly went through my middle years. So we put this book together. We got some of the best authors that Duquesne has produced over the last few decades. Tonight we're here with Bob Healy. Bob did four of my favorite chapters, including one on our alma mater, and we're going to start talking about that a little bit. To me, it's one of the things that happen in the stadium, especially early on, where most people don't really realize that it happened. The first national championship or championship per se that occurred in the stadium occurred in 1973, and it was Duquesne University Club football. Why don't you tell us a little about that and some fun things you found out about that game?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Dave, for letting me do that. Good to see you. So a lot of people aren't aware of some of the let me say, actually, people are more aware, obviously, of the major league sports that are played at a venue like Three River Stadium. And when we think of like great events that have happened there and championships won there, we tend to think of obviously the Pirates and the Steelers, and to a lesser extent, games between like Pitt and Penn State and what have you. But actually, some of the coolest moments at big facilities like that, at major league facilities, involve teams and programs and events that are a little below the radar. And one such event occurred in 1973 when our alma mater, Duquesne University, had its football team, which was at a club level or non-varsity level back then, play a national championship game at that stadium in what was known as the National Club Football Association. There were roughly, actually have the number in the chapter, but more than 100 teams. I mean, it was a big, large contingent of colleges and universities that wanted to field non-varsity football. And Duquesne was ranked number one that year. And the number two ranked team was a team from Connecticut called Mattituck Community College. And Mattituck had a big roster and a lot of big players and were a pretty good team. And Duquesne, despite being ranked number one, were kind of underdogs. But they were able to swing a national championship game for the 1973 club football season at Three River Stadium, of all places, where Duquesne had played some home games due to some connections and some finagling that they were able to pull off. And Duquesne won a national championship on the field, number one versus number two at the club level that season. And it's still a celebrated moment in the history of that program, and a big reason why Duquesne football got back to the varsity level later in the 80s.
Dan McCann was certainly the coach when they fielded their first NCAA team in 1979 since the early 40s.
79, right, excuse me.
He was the coach of that team. Why don't you tell us a little about what you know about Dan McCann?
Yeah, they called him the big guy. Dan was a high school coach when Duquesne football hired him. And a few people, snapped their heads on that, wondering why a college program, albeit a club college program, would go and hire a high school coach. And so I interviewed some of the players and managers of the team, the students who brought the sport back to Duquesne, one of them being Sam Costanzo, who was sort of the ringleader on that. And Sam said, people were curious as to why we hired a high school coach, but he said it's really simple. He was undefeated at North Catholic for 3 years. He was a freshman team, but for 3 straight years that his team at North Catholic, their freshman squad, never lost a game. So Costanzo told me in my interview for that chapter, he said, I don't care what level you're at, winning is winning. And to boot, it didn't hurt, I don't think, that Dan had some pretty good connections to football royalty in Pittsburgh. He grew up on the north side, was friends with members of the Rooney family, played youth football with members of the Rooney family, and was also a backup quarterback for the University of Pittsburgh in his playing days. So Dan, you combine all of that with the fact that he was a pretty high-ranking salesman at Pittsburgh Brewing, and he knew a lot of people, and he made a really good impression on the students, and so they hired him. He was not the first coach. There was a man In 1969, they hired first. But then after that 69 season, they kind of struggled. I think they went 2-4. They needed some help to get over the top, and so they hired Dan. And then it was he was the winningest coach in program history for a long time until Greg Gattuso and then later Jerry Schmidt broke those records. But yeah, without Dan McCann, I think it's likely they never win that national title and never get to the varsity level, as you mentioned, in the late 70s, early 80s.
So they certainly have a lot to thank Dan McCann for. I covered Duquesne football in 81 through 83 for the Duke, and he was always just an interesting guy to talk to after the game. So certainly enjoyed that. Now, we certainly take about 20 years later. After we win the City of Champions in 79, we kind of have a quasi City of Champions in 92. The Penguins winning, the Pirates on the last of their stretch as Eastern Division champions, and the Steelers starting a rebirth in 92 that has, for all intents and purposes, lasted to this day. One of the great stretches, even greater than their first run in the 70s. That 92 season was a special year. I remember it, and one thing I remember about it was I blame the curse of horns for destroying the chance to win 3 championships, because after the Penguins won and the Pirates looked like they were going to capture the 92 National League crown, Horns put out a City of Champions shirt with all 3 teams on it. And then it all proceeded to go to hell at that point in time. So I blame Horns for destroying that, but it was a special year nonetheless. Why don't you talk a little about that chapter and what went through there?
Yeah, sure. I think I remember that T-shirt. I want to say they kind of stretched the City of Champions moniker out to the 3 division champions. There was a pirate standing there with 3 pennants over his shoulder, right? But they weren't actually, you don't win a pennant unless you win the whole league, but they just said Central Division on them or whatever. So actually was it the East then, but nevertheless, they weren't really, part of that. And I do think it was a jinx. And speaking of jinxes, I know we'll get into the Steelers in 94, 95 later with them jinxing a trip to the Super Bowl in 94. But that was the reason 92 is so memorable. And I admit this in the chapter is that people will always see Sid Bream beating the throw from Barry Bonds after the Cabrera hit. And for good reason. It's still one of the greatest baseball games, whether it's related to Pittsburgh or otherwise.
I think you mean most painful baseball games.
That's true too.
Okay. All right.
Not in Atlanta. They love that game. But all throughout the country, that game is considered, right? It's one of the best games. Imagine if we were on the other end of that, how we still wouldn't be over it, So even though Atlanta didn't go on and win the World Series, that was for them to win the pennant in that fashion. I want to say after Bill Mazeroski hit the Game 7 homer in 1960, this was the next Game 7 clinching hit, you know what I mean, in the bottom of an inning. So we were on both good and bad of that. But so I start the chapter by admitting 92, was obviously remembered for a very poor reason in Pittsburgh history. But I called the chapter All Things Considered, and 92 in the City of Champions actually really wasn't that bad, because if you think about it, it was sort of it was the first time that the Steelers and the Pirates had won division titles in the same season since the 70s. So the 1970s really spoiled us. And although I'm too young to have lived through that, obviously all the history and research is there. And you can see Pittsburgh went pro sports crazy in the 70s by winning 7 division titles for the Steelers, 6 for the Pirates. I mean, that's 13 in 2 major sports in 1 decade. Right. So the 80s, that made it especially hard to stomach that both teams were mediocre to bad. And so when you think about it, 92, Chuck Noll retires, and then Bill Cowher comes right in and wins Coach of the Year by the AP, and the Pirates win their 3rd straight division championship, which hadn't happened in the National League since the 70s. I mean, that is a pretty good year. So I touch a lot on the good that happened that year, including the 92 division clinching game that was at Three River Stadium in late September. It was Danny Jackson, who was a trade acquisition that year, is the one who clinched the game with the win. He threw 7 innings. Jay Bell had 2 RBIs, and then Danny Cox and Stan Belinda, whom we remember for bad reasons in the 92 NLCS Game 7, he closed out that game to win the division. So there's plenty of good and plenty of good in the careers of guys like Stan Belinda and Pittsburgh, but clearly we remember it for terrible reasons, not the least of which is Cabrera, but also the Steelers losing in the first round to the Bills.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the Steelers were the 1 or 2 seed. I forget which one, but they got to buy the first round. And I think they would have got crushed by that Houston team. I know they beat them during the year, but Houston was probably the best team in the league at that point, in the AFC. But to see Frank Reich coming in after the great comeback at Buffalo, where they came from way behind against Houston, what's considered the greatest comeback in NFL history. And you thought that defense could crush Reich, that he couldn't do that 2 weeks in a row, and he did. I mean, he certainly did, and that was frustrating. But you knew that Pirate team, that was it. I mean, you knew it was it. That was the pressure of that Game 7 of the NLCS on top of everything else. I mean, you didn't expect them to be 20 years bad. And to lose a game like that and then lose for 20 years, I mean, you can't write a worse beginning for a franchise than that.
Yes, agreed. It's like a documentary that would be the opening scene, right?
Yeah.
Like is Andy Van Slyke in center field, resigned to the fact that he knows it's over, that according to him, he could have prevented it if Bonds would have listened to him, right, and shaded a bit. You can just see all the bad things, that happened just one after another, culminating with that bang bang play at home. And that, had we known at the time we weren't going to win for 20 more years, it would have felt even worse. So looking back on it, it does make it feel harder to take.
I mean, there's so many things. The Jose Leaned error, who never makes an error.
Yeah, right.
Belinda had the strike zone. They had the new home plate umpire in the later innings, and he was squeezing the strike zone on him. I mean, there was just every possible thing, the Van Slyke Bonds thing. But the thing about baseball is, with a long season, you get a good feel about a team, because you every night you've been with that team for how long. They win 97, 98 games that year.
Can't recall, but yeah, they're good, very good team.
Yeah. So it's still, I was I won't point the camera over there, but I have the chair that I was sitting in. I ended up devastated for 20 minutes, but you're right. You look at that game from a country standpoint, it's a top 10 all-time game.
Yeah, it is. It's the first time I cried at a sporting event, and which would actually transition nicely into 94, because I cried at that one too. I was a kid. I think a lot of grown men cried too, but if I may throw one more positive to Pittsburghers about 92 and Three Rivers Stadium alumni, is that Steelers team more or less clinched their division over the Oilers by going 7-1 at Three Rivers Stadium that year, and that included a 21-20 win at Three Rivers on November 1st against the Oilers. The Steelers overcame a 13-point deficit in the fourth quarter to win it. That's a great, memorable game that happened at Three Rivers Stadium in 92. So, we have to consider that, really. I mean, when you consider the lost decade of the 80s of Pittsburgh sports, that was the 90s started very well. And don't forget, Pittsburgh Penguins won 2 straight Stanley Cups, including 92, when there was a ceremony at Three Rivers Stadium and Brian Trottier sliding across the tarp. I mean, that happened in 92. And those memorable moments, we should not forget that we were really pretty spoiled, actually.
Well, we were. And you're right. The 80s were bad the whole way around. I mean, Pitt football, one of the great programs in the early 80s, collapses. Our Duquesne Dukes, that's when it collapsed, was after 81, when Father Nesty took over and just, pardon my language, deballed the athletic department.
And we're talking basketball at this point, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. I mean, that's probably why you remember the 92 so especially. But, I won't throw him under the bus, but let's just say a buyer named Jeff Dunn that I warned about buying the shirt and causing the jinx.
Yeah.
Was the man that did not heed my advice, and course, he made a lot of money on it for the store, but you know,
Hey, yeah,
first thing was
that's what mattered to him.
that's what mattered to him. That's
Yeah.
what mattered to him. But you come into 94, 95, the Steelers have matured by 94 into a legitimate Super Bowl threat. A well-rounded team, a great defense. Neil O'Donnell was, people remember him for the Super Bowl 30 interception, which in my eyes was more, I think it was Andre
Hastings.
Hastings who made a wrong cut. And had he ran the right play, Myron Cope said he'd still be running for a touchdown, and the game changes on that.
Mm-hmm.
But as a quarterback, you take the blame on it. But to me, those were two of the greatest teams in Steeler history, even Super Bowl bound. I put them up against certainly Super Bowl 40 and Super Bowl 43 champions.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I think the 94 and 95 teams. 94, I think, was the better team. 95 was better offensively. I think 94 was the better team. You had a healthy Rod Woodson. Why don't you talk a little about both years there?
I couldn't agree more, Dave. I'm glad you said that. I was going to bring that up. 94's team, it was better than 95's team, I think, in not in every way. You mentioned 95, a little bit better offense, which is ironic considering Barry Foster left and was replaced by Eric Pegram, he was productive, but, he and Morris kind of split the load. Bam Morris was on both of those teams, but the defense, especially in 94, was really incredible. And you're talking Hall of Famers and first team All Pros all through it. Speaking of people with great peaks like Barry Foster, the peak of Greg Lloyd, he was playing at a Hall of Fame level for a long time, and 94 was probably, 94 and 95 were that level, but he and Kevin Green and again Rod Woodson and the rest of that defense, they were ranked number 2 in the whole league, and their point differential was pretty outstanding. They were the number 1 seed, not the number 2 seed like they were in 95. And that AFC Championship game in 94, they should have won. They outplayed the Chargers, but they even outplayed them more than the Steelers outplayed the Colts in 95. It's just that the Steelers happened to win that game. Some of the other guys, that 94 team that I haven't mentioned, Dermontti Dawson's in the Hall of Fame, right? So it's, and again, you mentioned Neil O'Donnell, but that team was built to compete for a Super Bowl and may have, who knows, with the kind of dynasties that were coming out of the NFC at that time, if they'd have won the Super Bowl. But they were clearly the best team in the AFC. And if they were not for a couple of questionable holding calls on players like Leon Searcy and, some that made the Steelers settle for field goals. And also if Bill Cowher had elected to maybe go for it instead of punting from like around the 40-yard line or 35-yard line, the game could have played out differently. But that game was so one-sided, yet the Steelers had to settle for field goals or nothing at all. And then the Chargers just had 2 long passes and 1 long pass interference penalty. And at the end of the day, all that mattered was the numbers on the scoreboard, not on the stat sheet. And yet they still had a chance to win that game had Neil O'Donnell found a way to hit Barry Foster in the end zone. But Dennis Gibson, who, was otherwise forgettable of a career, he was a good player, but he bats that ball down right at the last second for the best play of his life. And that was it.
And maybe if Bam Morris is there a year earlier, you have that big guy inside the 5.
Well, Bam Morris is on both teams. It's that Eric Pegram comes a year later.
They didn't use Bam Morris.
Yeah, that's right.
They
decided to pass when they got down to the end zone there. Yeah. Go figure, right?
Yeah. No, I thought the play would have been put your big back in and try to.
At least twice. They never did. It was they threw a short pass to the fullback John L. Williams, and he's the one who got the ball to the 3. But, it was all passing plays. They had time. Time wasn't really a factor. There was time left on the clock when Gibson batted that ball down. Right. But, yeah, you talk about jinxes. That was the first year for the Here We Go Steelers song.
Right.
And it was also the year that the Steelers players came up with a rap about them going to the Super Bowl. Yeah. And the Chargers just put that right up on the bulletin board, and provided them what they needed.
Yeah. No, it was I thought it was a shame. I thought you mentioned dynasty with those 2 teams. I thought one of the things that cost him the dynasty was, say all the positives you want about Cowher. He was a great coach, don't get me wrong, but his thought process of Stewart was going to be his quarterback. He let Neil O'Donnell walk away. I think Neil O'Donnell was a great quarterback. And I think with that team, they compete for Super Bowls as you go through the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was one of the biggest mistakes since the year of winning began in 72.
Mm-hmm.
Probably one
Yeah,
of the
good point. Good point. Yeah, Cordell Stewart shows up in 95 as that triple threat. And then eventually, Bill Cowher decides he's the quarterback. And he does have, when he becomes the full-time starting quarterback later in the 90s, he has that one great season where he's rushing in, throwing for touchdowns every game.
Yeah.
And he was like everybody's number one pick in every fantasy league the next year, but then he sort of just fell off a cliff.
They
And
figured
was not really a, steady starting quarterback.
No, he wasn't an accurate guy by any stretch. And if you look at his performance in 95, it was very heavy towards the first few games. I think teams learned how to defend him later in the year. The defense was very strong and kind of kept it there. But he was not spectacular towards the later end of his season in 97, and especially in the playoffs against the Patriots. And he makes the great run against the Patriots to win the game, but pretty much has a lousy game other than that, and was not good at all against Denver.
Yeah, another disappointing Cowher loss in an AFC Championship game. Yeah, it was. I mean, Cowher, I mentioned in the book, he's greatly remembered here he is a Hall of Fame coach. You could argue whether or not Cowher deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, but he has a better resume than many there. But some will only remember him for a very poor record in AFC Championship games, including going only 1-4 at home. And I don't think any of them were as bad as that 94 game against the Chargers. There's just no reason they should have lost it.
No, that was not a good team. I mean, they were damn lucky. I know the weather was hospitable towards them. It was a very warm January day. It was in the 60s. So you didn't get the cold effect, so to speak. But
right,
the record when West Coast teams come east in NFL history is just very poor. Very poor.
Yeah, especially that time of year.
Yeah. So that was, I agree with you. That was certainly a blown game. And conversely, probably in my eyes, the greatest football game played in Three River Stadium happened the next year.
That's right. Yeah, that one didn't end in tears for me. I was a young. I was not even quite a teenager yet, and I was obsessed with Pittsburgh sports, like most of our fellow writers are, right? And so I just fell in love with these Steelers teams in '94 and '95. And I remember when we beat the Colts. I say we because I'm such a fan then. When the Steelers beat the Colts in '95, I just remember taking off into the street with the terrible towel. I told my dad, we got to go drive around the neighborhood, wave the towels, and scream out the windows. And that was like one of my favorite memories as a kid. And that team still did have all these Hall of Famers on it. It didn't have a healthy Woodson. He did come back and play in the Super Bowl. But Neil O'Donnell was still a very good quarterback. You had Morrison Pegram. You still had Dermontti Dawson. You had an otherwise really good defensive backfield that had they picked up the slack from Woodson being out. Guys like Darren Perry, those guys, Willie Williams. I mean, they showed up pretty big in '95, and then of course still Green and Lloyd. So they did outplay the Colts, not as bad as they outplayed the Chargers in '94, but that was certainly they did deserve to win. So thank goodness that ball gets batted away in the end zone, right? As many as 5 or 6 Steelers got a piece of it before it hit the turf. And if not, we'd be, imagine the thought about Cowher had he lost that game as well. In fact, if that ball ends up being caught, I think it was Aaron Bailey, I want to say, in the end zone for the Colts. If he comes down with that catch, Bill Cowher probably doesn't go to the Hall of Fame one day. He'd only have the one Super Bowl appearance. He would have had another AFC championship game at home. But that wasn't the case. The ball ended up on the turf. It was the correct call. I think everybody for a second freaked out and thought that guy caught it. And luckily the officials made the right call. Ball hit the ground. And Steelers end up going to the Super Bowl, losing to a good Cowboys dynasty. O'Donnell throws those bad interceptions on some miscommunication. But that was 95 was like you say, I think one of the best, along with 94, best Steelers teams that have been around.
One of my great thoughts at that game, with a little under 2 minutes left, the Colts' great linebacker Quentin Coriat
Oh,
has interception right in his hand, and I believe it was Ernie Mills
it was.
to know where to uh, deflect the ball out of his hands. That's the game. I mean, that's a game at that point.
He reached behind him and knocked it away. You
Yeah,
know, yeah, played D-back on that play. You're right. That would have ended it. What a heartbreak.
yeah.
Yeah, Ernie Mills, and he was Ernie Mills is the same player who had made the catch down to the 1 or 2 yard line to set the Steelers up to take the lead.
And
So,
that shows the difference at that point. Putting a big back in your backfield at that point, you were able to run the clock down,
mm,
and you comfortably got a touchdown at that point.
yes,
You know,
yeah, that's when Van Morris did. He scored at the end
yeah,
of that, and near the end of the fourth quarter. Right, they end up handing the ball off and scoring that time.
yeah.
It's,
They stop him once, and they ran good clock off at that point,
that's true.
and then he scores on the next play. But I remember I would have freaked out if I was watching it on TV. At the angle we were at, you clearly saw the ball hit the ground, and you clearly saw the referees wave it off. So I didn't think it was that close until I watched the replay on TV. And it was like,
Yes.
oh. But that's probably the only time. Well, I was a freshman at Duquesne in '79. So when the Steelers won their 4th Super Bowl and the Pirates won the World Series, we thought it was just going to keep going on. I mean,
Right.
we didn't realize it would take 16 years to get back in the Super Bowl. And I just remember collapsing in my seat, and I started crying a little bit because it was so emotional
Yeah.
after all that wait. And that was probably the most emotion I ever felt in that stadium over all the years.
I'm going to throw one more big play from that game at you, Dave. I know you remember this because I mentioned the guy's name already. When Willie Williams, the Colts were about to run out the clock themselves, right?
Yes.
Before the Steelers got the ball back and Van Morris scored, and then Harbaugh comes down and almost wins the game. The Colts were about to run the clock out, and they had almost a sure first down on 3rd and 3 or 3rd and 4, whatever it was. The seas parted, and the Colts running back had nothing but turf in front of him.
Right.
And off the weak side, from the backside anyway, Willie Williams comes out of nowhere and just shoelace tackles the Colts running back. And if not for that play there, the clock gets run out.
Greatest tackle in team history.
That's
Greatest
right.
tackle in team history.
And no one, including me on TV, did not see him until he was on him. He came out from behind the play. No one blocked him. They figured they'd hit the hole quick enough. But if he doesn't get a piece of his shoelace and he doesn't trip him up, he's gone for a first down. Steelers probably might never get the ball back.
Right. No, absolutely. They probably wouldn't have got the ball back.
Yeah.
At that point in time, they were either out of timeouts or they only had 1 or 2 left. I think it was 1 left they had.
That sounds right.
But this to me, we've done a lot of good work together. But this was the funnest project we've had. I mean, we all just had great memories at Three River Stadium. And it really turned out into a great book. And your chapters were such highlights, especially the '73, which to me, just personally, when your school wins a national championship and you do it on that turf, makes the stadium a special place.
Thanks for saying that. I obviously loved your chapters too, Dave. I've always been a fan of yours. And that '73 chapter was so much fun to write because it is a forgotten event. But people might be surprised to know that was the Three River Stadium's only college football playoffs game. The only time a college football playoff game had ever been waged at Three River Stadium in its whole history was that game. And it was also Pittsburgh's first bowl game. It was at that point was the only time a bowl game had been played. It was called the Children's Hospital Bowl because McCann found a way to give proceeds to the hospital and he got press coverage. And so people showed up and, for the guys that started that club football team just 4 years earlier, it was this culmination moment for them, that, oh, wow. And they won the biggest title they could get at that level of football. And it really cascaded into, the great program that Duquesne football has turned out to be at the 1AA or FCS level now. But it really began then. And it had its early zenith at Three River Stadium. So that was a lot of fun to do and write. And so for those of you who really like, those of you watching this, who really like kind of obscure sports knowledge or are proud of Pittsburgh's overall sports history, that might be a really cool one to check out.
Absolutely. But my friend, I appreciate you popping on here, talking about our book. We got a couple more coming up. Pittsburgh First. which certainly was a very interesting book. We'll talk a little more about later. That'll be up towards the end of this year. First happenings in Pittsburgh, and we're working on, I see is that a Gold Gloves hat?
But South Park Boxing.
South Park Boxing.
That's right.
Bob does some great work on amateur boxing in the book we're working on right now on the 60th anniversary of the building of the Civic Arena.
Yeah, I hope you all enjoy it. That was a fun one to write for me because I was used to be an amateur boxer and my family runs the South Park gym. So thanks for mentioning that. And we didn't touch terribly much on 95, but there's some cool stuff in there, including a quote from an ex-Pirate talking about fan upheaval day and what Major League Baseball was like after the players' strike and things that happened at Three River Stadium with people throwing stuff on the field. So yeah, if you pick up the book, I think you'll enjoy a little bit of insight there too from 95.
Absolutely. That'll be awesome. Right now you can buy it on Amazon and all online bookstores. And hopefully soon, within the next few weeks, the bookstores will open up in Pittsburgh and we will be there. We will be there. And when the pandemic is come to an end, we will be setting up a question and answer session among the 13 of us who did the book. And we'll be talking Three River Stadium at a bookstore near you.
All right. Yeah, can't wait.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. And you guys have a great evening.
You too, Dave. Great seeing you.